prisoner directed the crime partners to go to the home of victim Gary Allen Hinman and have him sign over his property.
Serial killers are known for their icy composure, but even they can unravel when the pressure mounts. Harsh questions and bold accusations have triggered everything from eerie threats to full-blown rage. These are the moments when serial killers snapped at interviewers and let their true nature slip.
This is over.
They need
That's it.
justice.
Captain, we're done.
Why can't you answer these questions?
I answered your question.
Huh?
You want to get this off?
Why are you running away?
Mark Ryby. Mark Ryby's name became synonymous with horror following his conviction for the murder of Donna Callahan in 1996. Callahan, a 29-year-old pregnant woman, disappeared from her workplace in Gulf Breeze, Florida. The case went cold for several years until Ryby's half-brother, William Alex Wells, made a shocking confession to a fellow inmate. Wells revealed that he and Ryby had abducted Callahan, and Ryby had strangled her in the backseat of their car before burying her body in a remote area. Wells led authorities to the burial site, where Callahan's remains were discovered. Ryby initially confessed to the crime, but later recanted, claiming that his confession had been coerced by law enforcement. This tactic of denial, paired with claims of manipulation, became a hallmark of his behavior in interviews and legal proceedings. Over time, Ryby was also linked to several other unsolved murders along Florida's Gulf Coast, raising suspicions that he was a serial killer with a far larger victim count than officially recorded. In 2017, Piers Morgan interviewed Mark Ryby at the maximum security Blackwater River Correctional Facility in Florida. Morgan, known for his no-nonsense approach, intended to investigate the disturbing details of Ryby's crime and subsequent claims of innocence. Ryby entered the interview with a calm demeanor, seemingly ready to assert his narrative and control the conversation. However, the atmosphere quickly grew tense. Morgan, unrelenting in his pursuit of the truth, repeatedly challenged Ryby's claims. The interview began to unravel when Morgan pressed Ryby about his initial confession and the damning evidence against him, including the testimony of his half-brother and the discovery of Callahan's body. Ryby's composure faltered as he began to grow defensive, accusing Morgan of siding with the police and attempting to paint him as a monster. The pivotal moment came when Morgan brought up Special Agent Haley, the lead investigator on the case who had documented Ryby's confession. Simply mentioning Haley's name caused Ryby's demeanor to shift dramatically. His calm facade gave way to visible agitation and his tone became combative. Ryby accused Morgan of being part of a broader effort to discredit him, stating, "You're twisting my words, just like they did." Morgan, unfazed, pressed harder, directly accusing Ryby of being a serial killer. "I think you are a serial killer," Morgan declared. This accusation proved to be too much for Ryby. His frustration boiled over and he snapped. Standing abruptly, he demanded to be taken back to his cell and began shouting at Morgan, insisting that the interview was a setup. The situation escalated further when Morgan followed Ryby's retreat, continuing to ask pointed questions about his guilt and the overwhelming evidence against him. Ryby, now visibly enraged, lashed out with defensive remarks, his voice rising as he attempted to deflect blame. The interview ended chaotically, with Ryby walking away and Morgan describing the encounter as one of the most intense of his career.
I don't believe you.
I don't care.
I think you are a serial killer.
You're wrong.
I think you did kill these women.
No, sir.
I think these families of these women.
Ryby's behavior during the interview offered a chilling glimpse into his psyche. His initial calmness seemed calculated, a deliberate attempt to control the narrative and present himself as a victim of injustice. However, his volatile reaction to Morgan's questions revealed a deeply unstable and manipulative individual. His outbursts, particularly his hostility when confronted with evidence, underscored his inability to confront the truth of his actions. Psychologists analyzing the interview noted Ryby's use of deflection and denial, common traits among individuals attempting to maintain a facade of innocence, his refusal to engage with the facts of the case, and his insistence on blaming others highlighted his lack of remorse and accountability. The interview left viewers both captivated and unsettled. For many, it was a stark reminder of the cold and calculating nature of individuals like Reeby. His outbursts and attempts to manipulate the conversation served as a testament to his dangerous volatility. Piers Morgan later reflected on the encounter, describing Reeby as one of the most challenging and unsettling subjects he had ever interviewed. Mark Reeby remains incarcerated, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The interview stands as a haunting example of how even the most composed facade can crumble under the weight of the truth. For those who watched, it offered a rare and disturbing glimpse into the mind of a convicted killer, revealing the depths of his denial and the lengths he would go to maintain his version of events. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos, one of the most infamous female serial killers in history, was convicted of murdering 7 men along Florida's highways between 1989 and 1990. Her victims were middle-aged men whom she lured by posing as a hitchhiking prostitute. Wuornos claimed that the killings were acts of self-defense, alleging that her victims had either attempted to assault or harm her. However, the brutal nature of her murders, including multiple gunshot wounds to each victim, painted a darker picture. Wuornos was arrested in 1991 after her lover and confidant, Tyria Moore, cooperated with the police and elicited a confession from her. The trial and media coverage that followed turned Wuornos into a household name, and she was convicted of 6 murders, receiving the death penalty for each case. Despite her claims of self-defense, the evidence against her, including ballistics and testimony from Moore, left little doubt about her guilt. In October 2002, just one day before her execution, Aileen Wuornos sat down with documentary filmmaker Nick Broomfield for her final interview. The conversation quickly devolved into chaos, providing a raw and unsettling look into her state of mind. Wuornos appeared visibly agitated, her demeanor shifting between moments of eerie calm and explosive rage. Her rapid, disjointed speech and intense body language reflected deep paranoia and anger. Wuornos made shocking claims during the interview, alleging that prison authorities were subjecting her to sonic pressure to control her mind and drive her insane. She accused the government, law enforcement, and even Broomfield himself of conspiring against her. Her accusations were wild and erratic, but they underscored the depth of her mistrust and deteriorating mental state. As Broomfield pressed her on past statements and inconsistencies in her accounts, Wuornos became increasingly defensive. When he attempted to compare her current claims with earlier ones, she snapped, "You changed your story," she shouted, her voice rising with anger. "What are you still talking about? Change the story on what? No, about whether it was self-defense or not. I'm not going to get into that." Her agitation grew as the interview progressed. Wuornos accused law enforcement of allowing her to continue killing during her spree, suggesting they wanted to create a spectacle by letting her crimes escalate. She portrayed herself as a victim of a grand conspiracy, claiming the system had set her up to be a scapegoat. Throughout the interview, Wuornos made threatening remarks, warning of supernatural retribution after her death. She believed she would return in some form to seek vengeance on those who wronged her. She even mentioned a supposed asteroid that she believed would strike Earth in 2019, wiping out humanity as divine punishment. Aileen Wuornos' life was shaped by profound trauma and instability. Born in 1956 to a teenage mother and an absent father, her childhood was marred by abuse, neglect, and violence. By her early teens, Wuornos was living on the streets, engaging in prostitution to survive. This tumultuous upbringing likely contributed to the anger and mistrust that defined her adult life. Her relationship with Tyria Moore, which began in 1986, was one of the few constants in her life. However, Moore's cooperation with law enforcement during Wuornos' arrest and trial was a significant betrayal in Wuornos' eyes, further fueling her paranoia and bitterness. As the interview neared its end, Wuornos' frustration boiled over. She abruptly demanded the conversation be cut short, stating, "We're going to have to cut this interview, Nick. I'm not going to go into any more detail. I'm leaving. Thanks for nothing." Her walkout was the culmination of an emotionally charged encounter, leaving viewers with an unsettling glimpse into her fractured psyche. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. Her last words, "I'll be back," like Independence Day, reflected her belief in supernatural vengeance and her defiance, even in death. Wuornos' final interview remains one of the most disturbing moments in true crime history. Her volatile behavior, coupled with her wild accusations and refusal to accept responsibility, painted a chilling portrait of a woman consumed by rage and paranoia. The interview offered a haunting glimpse into the mind of a killer on the brink of death, leaving an indelible mark on those who watched.
Police in Los Angeles believe they have their man, Richard Ramirez, arrested today after being held by an angry crowd.
Richard Ramirez, infamously known as the Night Stalker, left a trail of terror across California during a brutal killing spree that spanned from June 1984 to August 1985. His crimes were defined by sheer brutality, including murder, sexual assault, and torture. Ramirez's victims ranged in age from 9 to 83, and his methods were as varied as they were horrifying, utilizing knives, guns, tire irons, and even machetes. His actions often involve satanic rituals, leaving pentagrams at crime scenes.
It was a sunny day, about 3 p.m.
Further amplifying the fear he inspired. Ramirez's reign of terror ended in 1985 after he was recognized by residents in East Los Angeles. A mob captured and subdued him until police arrived. During his trial, he was convicted of 13 murders and 11 sexual assaults, among other charges. The judge sentenced him to death, describing his crimes as
Matter is recessed until October 24th, 8:30 in this court.
evidence of cruelty, callousness, and viciousness beyond any human understanding. Richard Ramirez's interviews revealed a chilling glimpse into the mind of a remorseless killer. One of his most infamous interviews was conducted in prison after his conviction, where his demeanor was as unsettling as his crimes. His cold, unflinching gaze was enough to make even seasoned journalists and law enforcement officials uncomfortable. His eyes, often described as lifeless and devoid of empathy, seemed to pierce through anyone who questioned him. When questioned about his actions and motives, Ramirez played a manipulative game of deflection and evasion. His responses were often rehearsed and cryptic, designed to provoke frustration and unease. Despite his crimes being well documented, Ramirez avoided admitting to any wrongdoing, claiming it would be improper for him to comment. His refusal to acknowledge his guilt only added to his menacing aura. While Ramirez maintained a facade of control for much of the interview, moments of visible irritation revealed cracks in his composure. When pressed about the number of victims and the nature of his crimes, Ramirez became increasingly defensive. The tension escalated to the point where he attempted to walk out of the interview, shoving the camera aside and muttering about being entitled to his opinion. This sudden outburst demonstrated his inability to handle being cornered or challenged, a stark contrast to the calculated predator he had portrayed. The interviewer later described the experience as deeply unsettling, noting that Ramirez seemed to relish the control he wielded in the room. His ability to manipulate the atmosphere with his responses highlighted the psychological games he continued to play, even behind bars.
I believe in the evil in human nature. This is a wicked world, and in a wicked world, wicked people are born.
Ramirez's defiance extended beyond interviews to his behavior in court. His trial was marked by theatrics, including drawing a pentagram on his palm and shouting, "Hail Satan," at the judge. He seemed to revel in the attention his actions brought, using the courtroom as a stage to amplify his dark persona. This defiance resonated in his interviews, where he often attempted to redirect conversations to broader philosophical points, claiming that we are all evil in some form or another. Ramirez's belief in Satanism was a recurring theme in both his crimes and his public appearances. He frequently alluded to dark forces guiding his actions, using this as a justification for the pain he inflicted. This belief, coupled with his chilling lack of remorse, made him a symbol of pure evil in the eyes of the public. Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death in California's gas chamber.
One of America's most notorious serial killers died this morning in a California hospital. Richard Ramirez.
Though he never faced execution. On June 7, 2013, he died of complications related to B-cell lymphoma while awaiting his sentence on death row. His death marked the end of one of America's most notorious serial killers, but his legacy of terror and manipulation remains etched in true crime history. The interview footage of Ramirez offers an unnerving glimpse into the psyche of a man who thrived on fear and chaos. His ability to maintain an aura of control, only to lose it when pressed, revealed the fragility of his carefully constructed persona. For viewers, his snapping moments during interviews serve as a stark reminder of the volatile and unpredictable nature of pure evil.
This is a videotape statement of Lorenzo J. Gilliard, a black male, 524 of 50.
Lorenzo Gilliard, infamously known as the Kansas City Strangler, was convicted in 2007 for the brutal murders of 6 women. His reign of terror spanned from 1977 to 1993, during which he preyed on vulnerable women, many of whom were sex workers. Gilliard's modus operandi was chillingly consistent. He would lure his victims, strangling them to death, and discard their bodies in secluded areas around Kansas City. Before his arrest, Gilliard had carefully cultivated a facade of normalcy. He worked as a trash company supervisor and lived a seemingly quiet life. This ordinary exterior allowed him to avoid suspicion for decades, even as the city reeled from the fear of a serial killer on the loose. It wasn't until advancements in DNA technology in the early 2000s that Gilliard's double life was exposed. Investigators linked his DNA to the murder scenes of multiple victims, unraveling the horrifying extent of his crimes. Despite overwhelming evidence, Gilliard maintained his innocence throughout his trial and conviction. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, yet his refusal to admit guilt remained a defining aspect of his public persona. In 2018, Gilliard participated in an explosive interview with Piers Morgan as part of a documentary on serial killers. From the outset, the tension between the two was palpable. Morgan, known for his confrontational style, probed Gilliard about the details of his crimes and the DNA evidence that irrefutably tied him to the murders. What started as a calm discussion quickly escalated into a heated exchange. Gilliard's demeanor shifted dramatically as Morgan pressed him on the overwhelming forensic evidence. At first, Gilliard attempted to maintain composure, deflecting questions and asserting his innocence. However, as the questions became more pointed, his frustration became evident. He accused Morgan of twisting his words and turning the interview into a biased spectacle. The breaking point came when Morgan mentioned the names of Gilliard's victims and demanded an explanation for the DNA evidence found on their bodies.
Lorenzo, here's Morgan. Good to see you. Come over here.
Gilliard's voice grew louder, and his responses became increasingly defensive and hostile. "You're taking things out of context," he snapped, glaring at Morgan. "You're making me look like something I'm not." The confrontation reached its climax when Morgan bluntly accused Gilliard of being a serial killer. "Do you think I'm an idiot, Lorenzo?" Morgan asked. "The evidence is undeniable." Visibly agitated, Gilliard stood up abruptly and demanded to be taken back to his cell. "I'm done with this," he said angrily, effectively ending the interview. The image of Gilliard walking out, seething with anger, remains one of the most memorable moments of the documentary.
You were charged with killing 13 women by strangulation.
The interview with Piers Morgan revealed not only Gilliard's volatility, but also his psychological manipulation tactics. Throughout the exchange, Gilliard tried to present himself as a victim of a flawed justice system, despite the mountain of evidence against him. His refusal to acknowledge his crimes or show remorse further underscored his disturbing detachment from the horrors he inflicted. Viewers were left shaken by the intensity of the confrontation. Many were struck by Gilliard's ability to display outward calmness while harboring such violent tendencies. The stark contrast between his composed demeanor and his snapping outbursts during the interview offered a chilling glimpse into the mind of a man capable of unimaginable brutality. The families of Gilliard's victims also weighed in on the interview. For them, it was a painful reminder of the lives lost and the justice they fought so hard to achieve. Some expressed frustration at Gilliard's continued denial, viewing his refusal to confess as an insult to the memory of their loved ones.
I'm sorry.
Let's not get into blood and guts, because that's what you're trying to get into.
Experts who analyzed the interview noted Gilliard's use of classic deflection tactics and his attempts to shift the narrative. By accusing Morgan of bias, Gilliard sought to undermine the credibility of the interview rather than address the evidence against him. This behavior is consistent with the profile of many serial killers, who often exhibit narcissistic traits and a refusal to take responsibility for their actions. The outburst and abrupt end to the interview also highlighted Gilliard's inability to maintain control when faced with unrelenting scrutiny. His agitation and eventual retreat revealed cracks in his carefully constructed facade, offering a rare glimpse into the volatile emotions that simmered beneath the surface. Tommy Lynn Sells. Sells was born in 1964 in Oakland, California, into a tumultuous household. His early years were riddled with neglect, abuse, and exposure to violence, shaping him into the disturbed individual he would later become. By the age of 13, his behavior had spiraled out of control. An incident where he crawled naked into his grandmother's bed led to his expulsion from his family home, forcing him to survive on the streets. At just 15, Sells claimed to have committed his first murder, killing a man who offered him a ride. This marked the beginning of a killing spree that would span over 20 years, across multiple states, and result in the deaths of at least 22 confirmed victims. However, Sells himself claimed responsibility for over 70 murders. His victims ranged from children to adults, and his methods were as varied as they were brutal, often using whatever weapon was available during his attacks. In 1999, Tommy Lynn Sells was arrested for the murder of 13-year-old Kayleen Harris in Texas, a crime that finally ended his reign of terror. While awaiting trial, Sells gave several interviews, but one particular interaction with ABC News revealed the unfiltered rage and depravity of his character. At the start of the interview, Sells appeared unnervingly calm, discussing his crimes with a disturbing lack of remorse. However, as the interviewer probed deeper into his past, specifically addressing the murder of a pregnant woman, his demeanor shifted dramatically. Sells visibly tensed, his voice grew louder, and his body language became defensive. When the interviewer pressed him further about the details of the murder, Sells snapped. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with menace, and warned the interviewer not to push him. In a terrifying moment, he described in vivid detail how he would kill the journalist if given the chance, saying, "What happens when your head hits the concrete? It cracks like a coconut." The outburst was a stark reminder of the violence that lay just beneath the surface. His ability to transition from calm and collected to aggressive and threatening in seconds highlighted the volatility that made him so dangerous. The chilling interaction left the interviewer visibly shaken and cemented Sells as one of the most unnerving killers to ever sit in front of a camera.
In the head. I wonder if you could just tell me what happened as you were killing her. Did she give birth to a baby?
You know, you're pushing your luck.
Sells' crimes were gruesome and shocking, often involving children, entire families, and random victims he encountered during his travels. In one particularly horrifying case, he murdered the Dardeen family in Illinois. After shooting the father, Keith Dardeen, he beat his 3-year-old son to death with a baseball bat, and then turned his rage on Keith's pregnant wife, Elaine. Sells beat Elaine so severely that she went into labor, only to then kill the newborn infant as well. This level of brutality was not isolated. Sells thrived on chaos and seemed to relish the power he exerted over his victims. He would later describe his murders as being like a drug, comparing the rush of killing to his early experiences with heroin. Execution and legacy. In 2000, Sells was convicted of capital murder for the death of Kayleen Harris and sentenced to death. During his trial, he remained unapologetic, often smirking in court and refusing to express any remorse for his crimes. On April 3rd, 2014, Sells was executed by lethal injection in Texas. Even in his final moments, he displayed a lack of remorse, his last words being a chilling, "It's time to go."
I asked her, "Why are you stealing?" She said, "I needed money." And I said, "You have a bank account."
Arthur Shawcross. Arthur Shawcross, infamously known as the Genesee River Killer, terrorized the Rochester, New York area between 1988 and 1990, leaving a gruesome trail of murders. Shawcross was convicted of killing 11 women, most of whom were sex workers. However, his violent tendencies first surfaced decades earlier. In 1972, Shawcross committed his first known murders when he sexually assaulted and killed 10-year-old Jack Blake and 8-year-old Karen Ann Hill in Watertown, New York. Despite the horrific nature of these crimes, Shawcross served only 14 years in prison due to a plea deal and was released in 1987. This release marked the beginning of his deadly rampage. Over 2 years, Shawcross targeted vulnerable women, luring them with promises of food, money, or companionship. His methods were brutal. He strangled his victims, mutilated their bodies, and dumped them near the Genesee River. The killing sent shockwaves through Rochester as fear gripped the community. Eventually, Shawcross was arrested in January 1990 after being spotted near one of his victims' bodies. His capture led to a trial that exposed the full extent of his depravity, resulting in his conviction and a sentence of 250 years in prison. In 2008, a documentary featuring Arthur Shawcross aired, offering a rare glimpse into the mind of the Genesee River killer. The interview started with Shawcross maintaining his characteristic calmness as he discussed his childhood, war experiences, and crimes. However, his composed facade quickly unraveled when the interviewer pressed him about his earliest victims, Jack Blake and Karen Ann Hill. Shawcross visibly tensed, his expression darkening as he was confronted with the murders of the 2 children. When asked why he wouldn't talk about those crimes, Shawcross snapped, his voice rising as he barked, "I don't want to talk about it. You say one more question, I leave now." The outburst was startling, as Shawcross had up until that point appeared calm and willing to discuss his later murders. His visible agitation and sudden hostility revealed a deeper psychological trigger surrounding the murders of Jack and Karen. Unlike his later crimes, which he spoke about with disturbing detachment, the mention of the children seemed to puncture his carefully controlled exterior. The interviewer attempted to push further, but Shawcross's temper flared again. He cut off the conversation abruptly, stating with finality, "It's over. Disconnect this. This is over." He stood up and stormed off camera, leaving the interviewer stunned and the audience unsettled by the rare glimpse of Shawcross losing control.
During the trial, I received a call from his mother. She questioned, why is he saying these things? Why are they claiming these things?
Your mom is obviously denied.
And there's always a bad man in me. You never can get rid of it. He's behind a door somewhere. I'm trying to keep him there. I don't want to hurt nobody else.
Arthur Shawcross's outburst during the interview highlighted his deep-seated shame or fear surrounding his first murders. Psychologists have suggested that Shawcross may have compartmentalized his crimes, viewing the later murders of adult women as separate from the killing of innocent children. When confronted with those earlier atrocities, the emotional defenses he had built over the years cracked, revealing the instability beneath his otherwise calm demeanor. Shawcross's refusal to discuss the child murders also hinted at a possible awareness of the societal perception of such crimes. While he had no remorse for his later victims, the murders of Jack Blake and Karen Hill seemed to trigger something deeper within him, a sign that even the most monstrous individuals can struggle to face certain truths. Arthur Shawcross spent the remainder of his life in prison at the Sullivan Correctional Facility in New York. He died on November 10, 2008, at the age of 63 from heart failure. His death marked the end of a life defined by violence, manipulation, and depravity. For the families of his victims, it was a small comfort knowing that Shawcross would never again walk free. The interview, however, remains a haunting testament to Shawcross's volatility. His sudden snapping under pressure served as a chilling reminder of the dangerous, unpredictable nature of individuals like him. It revealed cracks in the cold, a calculated act he had carefully constructed, exposing the simmering rage and instability that lay beneath the surface. These interviews reveal the chilling psychology of individuals who commit unimaginable crimes, offering a rare but unsettling glimpse into their disturbed minds. The emotional toll on victims' families and communities is immeasurable as they grapple with grief and the pursuit of justice. Which of these moments shocked you the most?
I come from hard times, bologna for Sunday dinner. I come from the Depression.
You come from not knowing your father.
I know my father. My father's all men.
Charles Manson. In 1986, Charles Manson, a notorious figure with a chilling past, sat down for an interview with Charlie Rose on CBS News Night Watch. This was no ordinary conversation. It was a tense face-off between Manson, the cult leader and convicted murderer, and Rose, the sharp interviewer. Manson was infamous for orchestrating the brutal murders of actress Sharon Tate and 6 others on August 8, 1969. Although he didn't physically commit the murders, Manson directed his followers to carry out this horrific act. Manson had been convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder on March 29, 1971, and was initially sentenced to death. However, in 1972, California temporarily abolished the death penalty, and his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Over the years, he was housed in various California prisons, including San Quentin, Folsom, and Corcoran. Known for his volatile behavior, Manson faced repeated parole denials and was a constant source of disturbance within the prison system.
In other words, I have to go into another person and put on another face. I got it. Play, you know.
I understand. So you say to Tex, you owe me one.
That's right. So then when my brother gets busted and my brother's in jail, then I tell Tex, pay him what you owe me.
During the interview, Manson's behavior was unsettling. His demeanor swung between eerie calm and sudden, intense outbursts. He would often lose himself in long, rambling monologues, veering off topic and making cryptic statements. His piercing stare and bizarre responses made the interview unforgettable. When Rose pressed him about his crimes, Manson deflected with philosophical rants, insisting that he was a victim of the system rather than a villain. He spoke of his traumatic childhood and years in prison, explaining how he felt molded by these experiences into who he became. Raised in a broken home, Manson's life was troubled from the start. Born to a 16-year-old mother, Kathleen Maddox, he was abandoned early on as she was frequently in trouble with the law. By the age of 5, his mother had been jailed for armed robbery, leaving Manson to fend for himself. By 9, he began his own descent into crime, getting his first taste of juvenile detention for petty theft. His time in juvenile centers and reformatories shaped his warped worldview, teaching him skills of manipulation and intimidation, techniques he would later use to control his infamous cult, the Manson family. When Rose raised the Tate LaBianca murders, Manson grew increasingly hostile. He claimed there was no murder and downplayed the brutality by framing it as a holy war, an excuse he often repeated. On that tragic night in 1969, Sharon Tate, a rising actress and the pregnant wife of director Roman Polanski, was murdered along with 4 others. Manson had instructed his followers, Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, to go to the house and kill everyone they found. The group's first victim was 18-year-old Stephen Parent, an unsuspecting visitor who was shot as he was leaving the estate. Inside, the killers encountered Tate, her friend, and celebrity hairstylist Jay Sebring, writer Wojciech Frykowski, and Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune. Sebring was shot and stabbed. Frykowski and Folger tried to flee, but were chased and brutally killed.
Because I got that Confederate sword in the kitchen. Don't invoke me. Do it. Get it done. How do we do it? I don't know. I don't want to be involved in it.
Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, was stabbed 16 times, her death marking one of the most horrifying events in Hollywood history. Despite the evidence, Manson refused to take responsibility, insisting that the media had twisted the truth. He maintained that he was a victim too, molded by a brutal system that he claimed had made him the person he became. His twisted justification and cold detachment in the interview left an eerie impression on audiences, revealing a man detached from the horror he had unleashed. On November 19, 2017, at the age of 83, Charles Manson passed away from natural causes at a hospital in Kern County, California. This marked the end of the life of one of America's most notorious criminals. If you think his calmness sends chills down your spine, Richard Kuklinski, literally knows as the Iceman.
I don't think so. I got maybe a little excitement. Most of the time, though, after that, I felt disgust. And I did it.
Richard Kuklinski. In 1986, Richard Kuklinski, known as the Iceman, was arrested. He became infamous as one of the most feared contract killers in American history. His crimes were horrific, but what made him even scarier was his cold, emotionless voice and the subtle threats he made during his interviews. Richard's journey into crime started with petty theft, but by the 1960s, he was deeply involved in organized crime. working for several mafia families, including the Gambino and De Cavalcante organizations. As he got deeper into the world of crime, Richard's reputation grew for being efficient and ruthless. He became a well-known hitman, someone everyone feared. His methods were terrifyingly varied and brutal. Richard used knives, guns, poison, and sometimes even his bare hands to kill his victims. He didn't care who they were, business partners, rivals, or even friends he believed might have betrayed him.
Difference in any of them. They were all pretty bad. He left his mark on me, pretty much.
In 1985, Richard's reputation reached new levels of infamy when he earned the nickname the Iceman. Authorities discovered that he had frozen one of his victims' bodies to hide the time of death. This gruesome tactic showed just how cold-blooded he could be. He was a master at making his murders look like accidents, or just not leaving any evidence behind. While in prison, Richard gave several interviews, and they were just as chilling as his crimes. He spoke about his murders with a cold detachment, showing no remorse for the lives he had taken. In one of the interviews, the interviewer noticed Richard's mood had shifted, and there was a sudden look of anger on his face. Richard's bad temper was one of the main triggers that pushed him to kill. He was easily irritated, and even the smallest thing could set him off. When asked what made him angry during the interview, Richard admitted he didn't like being criticized. The relationship Richard had with his father, Stanley Kuklinski, played a huge role in shaping his violent behavior. Stanley was an abusive alcoholic who constantly mistreated Richard. He physically and emotionally abused him, which created a deep hatred in Richard from a young age. To make things worse, Stanley killed Richard's older brother Florian by pushing him down the stairs. This traumatic event left a lasting mark on Richard, fueling his anger and resentment even further. Growing up in such a hostile environment forced Richard to harden his emotions and develop a tough exterior just to survive. Despite all his crimes, Richard showed no remorse and was open about his violent tendencies. His interviews gave a chilling look into the mind of a man who had no fear or guilt about the people he killed. He lived his life in a world where murder was just a job and nothing. No one was off limits. Richard Kuklinski died in prison on March 5th, 2006, in Trenton, New Jersey. Even in death, he remained a chilling figure in criminal history. If you enjoyed these cases, then make sure to check out our next ones, shown on screen.